Good day, everybody. Welcome back to DEGN Talk. Today we have a very special guest, Tausif from IO.net. Welcome.
Hey Jack, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming. We've been trying to arrange this for weeks, so it's really exciting that you're here. So, Tausif, would love to know about your journey in Web3 so far and what has led to the creation of IO.net.
Absolutely. A few different things. I think my journey in Web3 started back in 2017, back around that whole bull market. Started reading the Bitcoin white paper, the Ethereum white paper, had my mind blown, started investing a little bit personally in the space. By the time I actually got around to, trying to work in the space full time in 2018, everything had blown up and the industry was so early stage that if you weren't a developer, there just weren't a lot of opportunities on the business side quite yet, right? The industry wasn't quite there back then. So at that time, I actually ended up going to work at AWS, which ended up being pretty fortuitous, right? Like not only because AWS is such a juggernaut in just like the tech space, but I kind of really understood a lot of what centralization in tech can lead to. For example, within like the first few months I was there, one of AWS's most major services, S3, which is their storage service, went down for a few hours. And I heard this crazy statistic that basically once S3 went down, a third of the entire internet went down with it, which is kind of staggering to think about, right? So it can really show you sort of how, if you have this single failure point, in something that's so critical globally, it can really have these repercussions that you won't really realize until it's too late. It kind of almost further took me towards sort of this ethos of decentralization and how important it was going to be as we're, going to continue to scale technology globally. So kind of around 2021, 2022, I ended up jumping into Web3 full time, joined Kraken as head of BD, helping lead a variety of their sort of non-exchange initiatives there. After Kraken, I took some time to kind of like really understand or go deeper into, various sort of areas of innovation within Web3, right? And I think one that particularly stood out was DeepIn, decentralized physical infrastructure networks, because it really kind of showed me how it could take sort of like the underlying blockchain technology, coordinate a lot of disparate resources, and provide a solution to the broader market beyond Web3 with, cheaper cost, flexibility, a lot of things that, go beyond just the fact that the solution itself is decentralized. Kind of around the same time, ChatGPT had come out, the AI boom was in full swing, and people quickly started to realize that GPUs were going to be a really major bottleneck in how AI was able to scale and how many people could use it and how models could be trained. So I came across IONet, who's building sort of like a solution specifically on leveraging DeepIn technology, building on Solana, and trying to solve this issue of the GPU supply crunch in Web3. So I think that combination of factors is what sort of led me to be at IONet today.
Awesome. When you entered the crypto industry in 2017, um, and what has happened now, is this what you envisioned, what the industry will become? Or was it very radically different from when you joined in 2017? Like what you envisioned 10 years on, roughly? Because we're not there yet, but we're 8 years in, roughly, give or take.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? I don't think anyone really would have been able to predict what the market in Web3 as an industry looks like today. Back then in 2017, I think the world looked really different. I think Ethereum was still very much kind of like almost like a proof of concept at that point in its first cycle, and things like the DAO hack and all these like major things happened in its history. I think what's been interesting is there's a lot of things different, but there's also a lot of things that kind of remain the same, right? I think with the ICO boom in 2017, there was an explosion of a variety of different ideas of how blockchain could be used to solve a bunch of problems, right? So I think there were actually a few, quote unquote, like compute deepens even back in 2017. I think Golem was one of the major ones back then who came up with sort of like this idea initially. But I think as with every sort of technology adoption curve and hype cycle, I think back then in 2017, the reality was a lot of those ideas were just ideas, right? Like the technology wasn't necessarily mature enough to kind of turn that into a reality at the scale people were sort of likely envisioning at that time. And I think with the progress that we've seen in the past 8 years, the amount of the maturity that the underlying tech has really gone through, like the infrastructure has really been battle tested, and sort of things like Solana, which have kind of really shown that you can run a blockchain at scale at like light speed, is kind of enables like that vision that kind of came in 2017 to become sort of reality today. And I think we're seeing a lot of those ideas kind of being revisited and kind of being taken to market in a more mature way today. But I think back in 2017, the idea of like NFTs, DeFi, stuff like that, no one really knew what was going to happen there, right? So I think there are a lot of things that are in the market today that I don't think anybody would have anticipated back in 2017.
Yeah, I think innovations are just going to get even more crazier as time go on, right? Awesome. Would love to know about io.net and what your current focus is.
Absolutely. So I'm a Chief Business Development Officer at io.net, mostly focused on things related to supplier management, everything related to sort of demand and sales and revenue, plus partnerships on the Web 2 and the Web 3 side. As a quick sort of background on io.net, the easiest way to explain it would be io.net is the Airbnb of GPUs, right? We take a disparate sort of a number of sources spread out globally in terms of underutilized compute resources and GPUs, whether it's from independent data centers, crypto miners, or like former crypto miners rather, all the way to sort of individual community members who have consumer grade GPUs like these 4090s in their gaming rigs at home. And we essentially aggregate that into our network and provide sort of like a front end platform called IO Cloud, which we then serve up to AI/ML researchers, developers, startups, enterprises, research labs to get access to that compute in a really flexible and cost-effective manner.
Awesome. What's in store for your customers or your community in the next 6 months?
Great question. A few things, right? So our focus for the past 12 to 18 months has really been in terms of like building up sort of like the underlying compute side of our business, right? Like essentially the GPU supply. And I think we've done a really great job with that. We've been able to aggregate a variety of GPU sources and data centers globally to build one of the most robust and largest deepened networks out there at the moment, which has been really exciting. In the past 6 months or so, we've started to see a lot of adoption on the demand side with a lot of customers across Web 2 and Web 3 kind of coming in and using our deepened network as well. I think where our focus is really starting to shift over the next 6 months and what we're kind of really envisioning is I think longer term, we almost want to be sort of like this one-stop shop for decentralized AI development, right? Like whether you want to call it like a decentralized AWS, some other name, but we essentially want to make it as easy as possible for AI developers to be able to build their decentralized AI apps and projects as quickly as possible, right? And we're aiming to enable that in a variety of different ways. I think sort of the first way was really sort of making access to compute really cheap and flexible and accessible for these developers. But I think beyond that, now over the next 6 months, we're going to try to abstract away the developer experience even more and kind of develop more tooling for these AI/ML devs to be able to build on a GPU deepen really quickly, right? So I think products that we release, such as like IO Intelligence, are kind of our first steps in that direction. And I think over the next 6 months, you'll start to see us release a lot more products that are iterations of IO Intelligence and even things beyond that, showcasing how different developers can leverage our deepen platform to build what they need.
Awesome. We'll touch upon IO intelligence and developer in just a moment. Um, yeah, I think when I first stumbled upon IO.net, I think it was the first project that actually made sense. I was like, oh, wait, that's actually really clever. You're giving basically your idle compute power, right, to power this ever kind of growing need for AI, computational power. And I was like, wow, this is clever. Let's dive deep into IO, right? So what is IO's way of decentralizing computing?
Absolutely. A few different ways, right? I think I just kind of touched on it slightly a little bit before, but fundamentally, we're offering a decentralized network for a variety of different supplier sources to come in and provide their compute, right? With a different incentive. Like, obviously, with sort of for like TG that happened back in last year, that was kind of like the main focus of sort of bootstrapping the supply side of our network. And then kind of eventually we sort of seed that in with more demand to kind of like naturally meet that supply side and kind of move that demand over. So what we've really done is we've kind of worked with a really deep network of independent data centers, some sort of spread out globally across the US, Europe, APAC. We have GPUs sort of across like the entire stack from, sort of like the highest end H100s and H200s now, all the way to sort of 4090s and 3090s that are at the consumer grade level from them as well. So we've also worked with, former like crypto miners and also like crypto projects like Render and Filecoin who sort of have node operators that like operate for sort of like different use cases, right? Like Filecoin, for example, with storage, and Render with rendering, where we've kind of opened up the space for them to come in and provide their compute, and essentially sort of expand the use case for their compute nodes through IO.net. And lastly, I think we've been lucky to have a really great community that's really engaged and that's really sort of taken us to the next level in terms of decentralization by being able to plug in their gaming rigs or even their MacBook laptops, right, like with their CPUs and things like that, into our platform to make our network even more robust and decentralized.
Yeah, once I get my hands on one of those good GPUs, I'll consider donating it to our IO as well.
Absolutely, please
So
do.
how is IO combining Web 2 and Web 3?
That's an interesting question, right? Because in terms of combination, it was almost something that evolved from the way that we built the project, right? And I think it was actually one of the things that attracted me to this project the most at the beginning. And kind of as you just mentioned, it's like the IONet sort of just like it just made sense when you kind of thought about how it operates, right? So what we've really done, like the Web3 aspect of it, is fundamentally what we've been talking about, right? We've been building on Solana. We've incentivized supply to kind of like bring in their GPUs into our network and really kind of like bootstrap that side of our marketplace. And we've kind of been able to build a really large DeepIn in a sustainable fashion using sort of essentially Web3 incentives, Web3 infrastructure, and kind of operating it in that way. But where the Web2 side really comes in has been on the demand side of things, right? So kind of as I mentioned, how our platform operates, we have sort of like the underlying network of GPU suppliers, but then we offer a platform on top called the IO Cloud, which essentially, abstracts away a lot of that network and how to actually use the blockchain, has a very sort of simple UI, and user experience and interface that anyone from sort of like a student or like an independent developer to a startup can just log on permissionlessly and see what sort of GPUs are available, where they are, what the pricing is, build a cluster and deploy it within 2 minutes, right? So what we found is the amount of like use case or like the amount of demand that exists on the Web2 side for a product like this is pretty immense, right? So when we kind of think of Web2 in this sense, it's sort of all the AI ML startups out there that are training models, using models for inference, like doing fine tuning, things like that. And they have a significant need for GPUs sort of based on however much like usage that their product actually is getting, right? Whether if you have like 100 million monthly active user Web2 AI app, like you're going to have billions of inferences a day, which leads to a significant demand in compute. So what we really see in terms of combining Web2 and Web3 is while we've built the product itself with Web3 native roots and infrastructure, a lot of the demand and the customer side of the equation has really come in from the Web2 side because they're really sort of interested in us, not only for the decentralization, but also for the cost effectiveness, the flexibility, and the access that we can provide through the way that we built the platform.
Yeah, it's beautiful where you're able to kind of cluster together the unused power, right, and provide that to people that really needs it. Now, the more compute usage, the better we are, right? Let's address the elephant in the room right now, right, which is DeepSeek, right? They've kind of made everything more, what can I say, cheaper, right, and more kind of efficient. So with the advent of DeepSeek, how does that affect the compute usage at IO?
Yeah, great question, right? And something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and have been asked multiple times since DeepSeek came out as well. So I think with DeepSeek, they really kind of like changed the game a little bit, right? In terms of, I think, or they sort of evolved it. I think with originally when sort of like ChatGPT came out from OpenAI and sort of like other closed source models from Anthropic and a few others sort of came out, there was always this sort of feeling that the moat that people would really want to have around their AI app would be the actual foundational model itself, right? Because that takes a lot of compute, a lot of training hours, a lot of sort of like sophistication, a lot of research to really kind of like make it come to fruition. But I think the game really changed when Meta open sourced their Llama model, LLM, right? I believe it was 3.1 when it first came out, and now it's at 3.3. And it really sort of put out a state of the art open source model in the world that anyone could really use. And then DeepSeek came along, and then they, made even further efficiency gains and like further drove down like the price point of what they did to train it, and open sourced it to everyone so everyone could use it. So what I think the initial sort of hysteria around DeepSeek's release was because it sort of went against this cost of training story, right? It sort of made people think it's like, oh, if DeepSeek is out there now, but it didn't cost that much, like why are we spending money on compute, and why do we need to train models, right? So, which is fair, but I think what it misses is it kind of shifted the actual sort of like usage of compute from one part of the stack to the other. What really happened with DeepSeek is with the release of the R1 model, it actually made state of the art foundational models accessible to everyone, right? So now with people, being like, okay, we don't actually need to train our own foundational models, and I don't need to buy up thousands of GPUs to train it and kind of do things from scratch. You can kind of build, stand on the shoulders of giants, and fine tune these models with sort of like your proprietary data and make it fit your use case in a much faster sort of way. It actually moved kind of where the necessity for compute was from the training side to the inference side. Like, so now that more people have access to better models and can fine tune it and deploy it much faster, at a higher in a higher quality fashion. What that actually means is more people who are their end users of these like businesses and apps, right, will get access to these
More
AI
accessible
models in
to
whatever
everyone.
fashion.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So it's going to be driving a lot more sort of inference demand, which will actually pull in a lot of that compute that was, sort of set aside for training. The increase in inference demand actually pulls in that excess slack from compute on that side.
Yeah, that makes sense. Every now and then you have something comes along that changes the game, right? I look at this similar to, back in the day when you had maps and navigation, right? And those cost money, right? And then you have Google that comes out and just gives it out for free, right? And then basically killed a lot of those companies, right? Because they were relying on subscriptions and stuff. And then you have Apple Maps come in and, and then so they have this war on making people's lives better, but for free. And
Yeah,
I do see this probably going to happen in AI as well, right? Someone will come along and just open source something that's, OpenAI is charging $200 a month for.
right.
Basically upended their entire business model, right? They were scrambling kind of with their hairs on fire because they have no idea what to do next, right? You have DeepSeek literally changing the game. And then with the advent of DeepSeek, like you said, it's accessible to more people, so more users will be able to use it, which actually equates out, right, to the overall demand, which could be even more than before. On that topic, we have lots of AI agents, right? So how does AI agents and how IO really fits in with those projects?
Yeah, this is another really sort of like interesting new innovation that's been coming up in the AI space over the past few months, right? I think it really caught the attention of kind of the Web3 space a few months ago. But if you got Jensen Huang's keynote from NVIDIA GTC last week, he mentioned sort of like this next stage in the evolution of AI is agentic AI infrastructure, right? So I think it's something that's beyond just some of the Web3 hype you may have heard. And that's kind of like turning it to sort of like the next wave of AI innovation. What's been really interesting is seeing how something like IO's decentralized compute network can really fit in and enable a, sort of like agent first future, right? Because when you sort of think about how an agent operates, it's a couple different things that it's like really looking for, right? If you want an agent to be another sort of like phrase that's used for AI agents, autonomous agents, right? So, and if you want your agent to be fully autonomous, you really have to kind of reduce all these different barriers and friction points that it might face when it tries to sort of accomplish its directive or whatever sort of prompt you've given it to accomplish. I think one of the things that kind of comes up quite often is sort of access to finance. If you have an AI agent, you're probably not going to have, like a driver's license or a social security number and things like that that are necessary for KYCing with, your bank and, kind of having a bank account and things like that. So it makes a lot of natural sense for AI agents to use crypto infrastructure for finance, specifically for wallets, right? Like they might transact using like Bitcoin, stable coins, other coins, the whatever sort of fits their particular need. So in that same way of an agent for it to be autonomous, needing access to decentralized finance and sort of like self-custody wallets and things like that. One of the other things it's going to constantly need is access to compute, right? And in the same way that there's going to be a barrier for this agent to access banking services through the traditional financial system, it's going to run into those same barriers when it tries to access compute through the traditional compute system of hyperscalers, right? Whether it's AWS or GCP or someone else. It's going to be really hard for it to go on to GCP, get the exact sort of services it needs without, talking to a account exec or solutions architect or sort of whatever process they have you go through to get the GPUs that you need. For the agent to be truly autonomous, it's going to need access to permissionless compute infrastructure. And I think that's where IO really fits in very naturally with sort of how autonomous agents will operate. Right? If an autonomous agent is going to have sort of a crypto wallet with stable coins or IO or Bitcoin or what have you, if it needs access to compute, it can much more easily access that through IO, going through a platform permissionlessly rather than going to AWS and being able to spend whatever sort of like crypto coin it needs to be able to do that. So I think that's an area where I see the permissionless nature of a compute deep like IO fitting really well with how AI agents will fundamentally operate.
Awesome. Let's touch upon IO intelligence. What's IO intelligence?
Absolutely. IO Intelligence is a new product we just launched. I guess it's been about a couple months now. But to connect to the discussion that I had that I mentioned earlier about how we're trying to abstract away the developer experience even more and just make it as easy as possible for developers to be able to build using AI. IO Intelligence is really the first step towards that, right? So fundamentally, IO Intelligence has is a product where we have about, I believe, 25 plus open source models. So, and they're some of the best and most well-reviewed and most used open source models off of Hugging Face, which is an open source model repository. And we host these models on our own decentralized GPU infrastructure and offer that up to consumers and developers in a couple different ways. One through a traditional chat playground interface that you might be used to through ChatGPT, but instead of having to rely on ChatGPT's closed source model, now you can select whether you want to use Llama 3.3 or DeepSeek R1 and have that be your LLM chat of choice through IO Intelligence. And the second way is we offer it up as an API inference endpoint for developers to be able to integrate open source models really easily into their own AI apps. So rather than having to pay top dollar for, OpenAI's API or Anthropic's API, you can use IO Intelligence's API to get state-of-the-art models like Llama 3.3 or DeepSeek and integrate that into your own AI application. And what's really exciting about this is if you think about, the type of developers who build within AI, there's a certain type of developer who's very sophisticated, kind of understands the hardware level of GPUs, is very comfortable updating NVIDIA CUDA drivers, scaling infrastructure up and down. And they're the ones who are kind of coming to our compute deep in, renting out GPUs, deploying clusters, and then doing all of the work to host models on top of that, right? But there is a 10 to 100x the number of developers who don't want to manage their own infrastructure, don't want to deal with like updating NVIDIA drivers. Like all they want to do is they have a cool idea for an AI app. They want to just access the AI through an API and integrate it, and then focus all their time on the thing that they do best, right? Growing their application, finding customers, going to market. Exactly. So that's what IO Intelligence is.
Awesome. On that topic of developers, what tip would you give them, right? Or what kind of support does IO have for them to come build an IO?
Yeah, great question. I think a few different things, right? So at IO, a key part of our ethos is to make it as easy as possible for developers to build. So I think one of the first things I'd recommend for builders to do is to just come onto IO's IO Cloud platform, load up a few credits, and try the platform out, right? Like try and deploy a cluster of especially a GPU that you might have had a harder time accessing, either because it wasn't available at other through other sources, or it was sort of like priced prohibitively for you. Just play around with the platform, deploy a cluster, check the pricing out, and see how it performs within sort of like your own infrastructure, and try some experiments out on that. Right? I think a lot of developers will be pleasantly surprised with the performance for like the price point and sort of how it works within their development workflow. And I think the other thing I will also say is for IO intelligence, I'd also recommend that developers who are building sort of AI apps and relying on sort of, closed source model APIs, I recommend that they kind of try developing with the IO Intelligence API as well, and kind of just see how the performance works while saving you on costs for you, essentially, right? Because I think we'd be able to sort of, in the same way that our compute deepen was able to sort of add GPUs to developers at 70 or 90% less cost than AWS, I think we'd be able to do something similar with sort of closed source open API models. So I think that's essentially one of the key tips that I would give builders. And I think, part of what we're able to do too is we try to make things as self-service and easy to use as possible. But for developers who want to graduate to that next level, who need more specific GPUs, who need sort of like higher rate limits, like I would say reach out to me and my team on Twitter, LinkedIn. My DMs are open. I think we can always hook you up with getting you the exact type of GPUs or model or performance that you need for your particular workflow.
Wow. You've heard it on DEGN Talk. This is Tausif. I'll be linking everything that we talked about in the tweet, including Tausif's Twitter, so you can reach out to him should you have needs and support from IO. And this concludes our episode. Tausif, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully, I'll see you again on DEGN Talk. Yeah, I'll see you guys later.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.